Hey everyone, my name's Shelby and welcome back to Bookshelves. Today I have a crazy big book haul to share with you all, and I promise I didn't buy these all at once. This is the accumulation of books that I have purchased over the first 7 months of the year. And for folks who are new around here, I've shared a little bit about my book buying philosophy in the past. My husband actually likes to call me a book dragon because I tend to collect books like trophies as opposed to buying them to read for the first time. We all know collecting books and reading books are two different hobbies. And when I got back into reading as an adult, I noticed that I was purchasing way more books than I was able to read in a timely fashion. And often I would, run out of the sort of enthusiasm for a piece well after I had purchased it and before I had read it. And I also ran into more than one really disappointing purchase where I was kind of bummed that I'd wasted my money on a book that really didn't pan out for me. So typically what I do is rent books via the library, at least to get a sample, if not to read the whole thing. And I also use some additional platforms, audiobooks on Audible and Everand, kind of get a sense of if I'm going to like a book. If I like the book, I will then either finish reading it in a physical that I purchase, or perhaps I will just buy that book at a later time to add to my collection. I really want my bookshelves to reflect all of my favorite books and be there for me if I want a reread or if I want to loan a book to a friend and say oh my gosh, this story was great. You would love it. So all of the books that we're going to talk about today are books that I've read over the last 5 years, since I started reading again as a grown-up, and will all be books that I liked enough to purchase. So you can consider all of them recommendations, and I'll share just a little bit about each one. That all being said, I think I have 20 books or so to share, so let's dive into the video. Okay, I have these broken up into 3 major categories. We're going to cover graphic novels, nonfiction, and fiction. Graphic novels is the shortest, so we can start there. Okay, longtime viewers will know that I am obsessed with Witch Hat Atelier. This is a manga series that is upside down. This is a manga series that was super popular a couple years ago and has continued to publish books. They take a while to come out in English. They're obviously published originally in Japanese. And this is volume 13. I think we get another volume this fall, which I'm very excited about. This is a super sweet but also quite serious story about a little girl who learns magic and the way in which that sort of shapes her whole world. We are deep, deep, deep into the series now, and volume 13 did not disappoint. A new graphic novel series I started this year is something I'm so excited about. I have wanted to pick up for a long time, and those are the Avatar: The Last Airbender graphic novels. These are a direct continuation of the TV show. I'm sure you've heard of it. I don't know anybody my age who wasn't raised on Avatar: The Last Airbender, but it is an elemental-based magic system with fire, earth, water, and air. The Avatar is a wielder of all 4 elements and in charge of, establishing world peace. The books pick up exactly where the show left off and cover a lot of the things that you've probably been wondering. So they answer questions about kind of bridging the gap between Avatar and The Legend of Korra, which is the follow-up series, and sort of how the world evolved from the world we know with Aang to the world we know with Korra. They also dive into things like, where is Zuko's mom? And what are all the other little things that slipped through the cracks when the Avatar was gone for 100 years? So I've really, 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 really loved picking this up. I'm 3 or 4 volumes in, and I think I purchased the first 5. So these are really nice. They're the hardback omnibus copies. So in addition to the actual novels, there are also notes from the artists and the writers inside about how they approached telling the story, which is really fun. And I just really liked the sort of presentation of them in these larger hardback versions. I think you get really beautiful, larger scale images. They come in a slightly sturdier, more well-protected package. And knowing that I wanted to read all of them, getting the bind-ups of 3 books per book was really sort of efficient use of my space and time. So I'm really jazzed to be reading these, and I can't wait to pick up the rest. Okay, on to nonfiction, and I think all of these are memoirs. So memoir is something I had no idea I liked until just a couple years ago. And I really enjoyed picking up memoir in audiobook form because it's often read by the author. So you get that sort of added layer of the experience of reading the story. That being said, these were all stories I really enjoyed and wanted to own in physical copies, especially so I could lend them out to friends and refer back to some of the really powerful moments in the written word. First of these is What My Bones Know, which is by Stephanie Fu and covers a really deep dive look into complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something she lived with. And it kind of chronicles her coming to that diagnosis and understanding really how it has shaped her adult life. It also, of course, reflects on the childhood that resulted in her diagnosis of complex PTSD. It is very heavy reading, but it's incredibly well crafted. Stephanie Fu is a journalist by training, and she literally records her therapy sessions and then sort of shares snippets of them throughout the book. She takes a really, I think, thoughtful, well-informed approach of talking about her experience with abuse and PTSD, and then kind of zooming out to think a little bit about how that might affect other people as well, especially other people in communities like the one she comes from. An incredibly powerful story, heavy. All of the stories I'm going to talk about here in the memoir section do come with trigger warnings of different kinds. So take this as sort of a blanket statement that they're all phenomenal stories, but they all come with a quick content warning if that is something you need to look for. The next of these, don't laugh, is Paris, the memoir. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I loved this book. I found Paris's story to be, again, incredibly well crafted. She is really funny, or her ghostwriter. I'm honestly not sure how much she wrote it versus somebody else, but she's very funny and, again, does this really compelling thing where she uses her experience to talk about a larger issue. So in the case of Paris Hilton, she was sent to one of those really horrifying military schools as a young person. They are incredibly abusive institutions, and they continue to exist in the US today. She experienced a great deal of harm in that institution and has since really leveraged her celebrity power to advocate against them. This story, I think, again, just does such a good job of zooming out and looking at all of the systems of power that facilitated her abuse in the first place, as well as the systems of power that sort of preserve these really alarming institutions. So it was a hoot. It was heartbreaking, and I was blown away by the Paris Hilton memoir. So I highly recommend it as well. The last of the memoirs kind of focused on the subject of abuse is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. Everybody's heard of this book. Everybody knows that this book is phenomenal. I don't think I have to convince you of that. But what I will say is that I was particularly moved by Jeanette's ability to write from the perspective of her younger self. So we get these scenes, these vivid scenes from her childhood when she's 7 and when she's 13 and when she's 20. And at each age, the voice that comes through is that of a child of that age. So I can't even imagine what it took to sort of really go back and sit in those memories so clearly as to convey how she really felt, how she thought about what was happening around her in such a clear, age-appropriate voice. But it was a real masterclass. I think the voice of this story is incredible. Like I said, I think almost everybody has heard of this book, so you probably know what it's about. But Jeanette McCurdy is a child actress famous for her role on iCarly. And she lived with an incredibly abusive mother whose abuse was relatively wide-ranging, but in particular resulted in an eating disorder and substance abuse issues that really shaped a lot of her young adulthood. And sort of her grappling with all of that in the wake of her mother's passage. So kind of the ways in which she, again, a lot of her therapy conversations are discussed in this book. How she kind of came to terms with the fact that her mother had caused her so much harm, because that was not something that she sort of held true for a lot of her life. And I just think it was a really, really powerful message. Again, quite funny, as the title would suggest. She takes it all on with a good sense of humor, but really, really heavy and compelling stuff. And here again, the larger message that she imbued in the story is what really sort of put it over the top for me as an exemplary memoir. She talks a lot about the ways in which the child star industry in Hollywood is also rife for abuse. And I think her message is a very important one for all of us to hear, especially those of us who grew up watching her on screen. The last story on my list is Spare by Prince Harry, which is also a commentary on an institution, just a slightly different one. I really enjoyed Spare. It is not a perfect book, but I thought it was a really compelling story, and there were several things that are worth sort of highlighting about it, in my opinion. It, first of all, is structured in a really accessible way. He talks about struggling in school, having a few different learning disabilities, and things that made reading in particular quite difficult. So I know he talks about ADHD. I'm not sure what else he talks about, maybe dyslexia. It's been a couple of years since I've read it now. But anyway, that informs how he structures the book. So all of the chapters are incredibly short. You can pick it up and put it down very easily. And he talks about like doing that on purpose. And again, I'm not sure how much of this is him versus a ghostwriter, but that intention really shines through, and it makes the book really approachable, which I think is wonderful. He talks about grief in a really compelling way in this book. He details a lot of the struggle and pain that comes from his experience of losing his mother as a child, the way the media has shaped his life and a lot of awful ways. And he talks a lot about the institution of the royal family and how it wields its power in these really inhumane ways. So again, I think that this is a compelling personal narrative, and it's one that I'm interested in, right? As an American, it's not a particularly high stakes narrative to me, but it is certainly one that has captured my attention, as it has many others. And it sort of goes that level above to really take a look at the institution of like tabloid press in England and the institution of the monarchy. But he's surprisingly critical of both of those institutions. And I think he makes really compelling points about the work that needs to be done to prevent the harm that he experienced from happening to another generation of people. Really a chorus throughout the whole book is that he doesn't want history to repeat itself in the way that he lost his mother, in the way that his wife Meghan has been targeted with such vitriol, and wants to raise his own children in a very different environment. So I would say pretty darn good, and I really enjoyed it. It's worth a read. Okay, next up is fiction. This is the biggest category, and again, it covers a large swath of time. So I'm going to do my best to give you a quick once-over of each book, but know that there are many of these that already have reviews on my channel, and others I'm going to be digging for a little bit. First on the fiction list is Spinning Silver. I actually only read this last winter, and it's phenomenal. Like, truly such compelling storytelling from Naomi Novik. It follows a young Jewish girl in sort of an alternative Russia-like setting. Her father is a moneylender, and not a very good one at that. And as her life starts to fall apart, she takes it into her own hands to handle the family business. In doing that, she sort of boasts that she can turn silver into gold. That word reaches the king of the Fae. He kind of comes along and tests that under the assumption that she meant it literally, and a sort of like modern fairy tale unfolds from there. It's really compelling. There are some really strong themes of domestic violence in this story. So it's another one I would put a content warning on before picking it up. Next is Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is such a top-notch book. I read it several years ago now, and I'm so glad to own a physical copy of it. Octavia Butler is a real classic of the sci-fi and dystopian genre, and Kindred is a story that follows a Black woman in the 1970s who keeps sort of like getting pulled back in time against her will, seemingly at random, into the antebellum South. And it sort of follows this puzzling out of why she's being pulled back into the past, how she can make it stop, and how she survives in the interim. It is a beautiful story, very immersive. Again, very heavy, as one might expect, with themes of slavery and sexual violence. So content warning there, but it is a top-notch book. And really, it's a classic for a reason. Okay, next is The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. And I have just like a tiny funny story about this, which is that when I first started reading again, like as a grown-up, it was 2020. I was in grad school. There was a pandemic. And I'd been watching the show The Handmaid's Tale. So one of the first books I chose to pick up was The Handmaid's Tale and its sequel, The Testaments, which was very newly released at the time. I had like not bought a lot of books as an adult yet, and so I didn't really have familiarity with the paperback cycle, and how like books are typically published in hardback unless they're straight to paperback, and then like 6 months later to a year, that's when you get your paperback release. So this book had just been published, and I eagerly purchased it alongside The Handmaid's Tale in paperback because I wanted them to match. And of course, there wasn't actually a normal paperback available, and I'm illiterate, apparently. So I accidentally bought the large print version of this book, like for elderly people and people with visual disabilities. So it's just enormous. Like my copy of The Handmaid's Tale was like this big, and then the large print was like this big. So now, like 5 years later, I have finally purchased the correct copy of this book and have donated the large print copy to my local Books for Cause so that somebody else can enjoy it, perhaps in a font that is more accessible to them. But this book is probably pretty widely known. It is a modern sequel that was written to the dystopian classic, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It follows a sort of semi-post-apocalyptic United States of America. There's sort of like a totalitarian regime that takes over the government with particularly religious views, and women are taken into custody, functionally, and forced into reproductive labor for sort of an elite religious class. The Testaments, I think, has been received a bit more controversially because instead of following a handmaid, it follows Aunt Lydia, who's one of the women in charge of kind of keeping handmaids in line. She's the villain of the first book. And I think that's a really compelling perspective. I think we get a lot out of Aunt Lydia being our main character, and I think it really challenges the reader to engage with what you would do if a world like this suddenly emerged and you had the opportunity to have a slightly more comfortable life. So I think it's a really compelling story. Would highly recommend it. And I would recommend it in a font size that's appropriate to you. This book, Monsters We Defy, is so underhyped. I think the only booktuber I've ever seen talk about it is Elliot Brooks. That's who I got this recommendation from initially. But I am obsessed with this book, and you should be too. Monsters We Defy is a fantasy heist story. It's set in like 1930s Washington, D.C., inside of a Black community where people have started to go missing. And there's sort of an understanding of a shared magic system where you can kind of commune with spirits who give you gifts and who kind of give you curses. Like it's a real sort of trade-off if you have a special ability of something that you lose. It's a heist story, which is so fun. It's like such an atmospheric setting. And we have a really fun, voicey character. And we sort of like hop from each perspective as we add new members to the team, which I thought was a really fun kind of creative element to the story. So if you're a heist fan like me, this is a must read. Okay, this is a new read, and I have actually only partially read it. This is the least well-informed recommendation I'm making today, but this is What the River Knows. I also have the sequel, What the Library Hides. They're super atmospheric and vibey stories set in an alternative version of the recent past. I think we're in like the 1940s, and we follow a young Argentinian woman whose parents who are like sort of hobbyist archaeologists, is my understanding, in Egypt. They go missing, are believed to be dead, and she shows up in Egypt to find out what happened to them. While she's there, she meets a sort of mysterious uncle, his handsome assistant, and all sorts of adventures unfold from there. I've read the first few chapters and was just immediately kind of tickled by the voice, and the premise really lends itself to a lot of my favorite things. So I'm very excited to finish this, and I'll have a full review probably in the latter half of the year. All right, we're very close to the end, just a few more now. Next on the list is Master of Jinn, another alternative Cairo story. Again, it's like the early 1900s, 1912 to be specific. And we follow a detective for the Ministry of Magic in this version of Egyptian history, who's tasked with investigating magic-related murder. In this case, the mass murder of a sort of strange occult society of Englishmen who are obsessed with Egyptian history and antiquing. So it's a very interesting sort of commentary on colonialism and the wide-scale theft that happened in Egypt, but also a commentary on this young woman who is queer and who is like one of the only women in her type of position as a detective in her field. She is so funny. She's very fashionable, which I like, and has a crew of very interesting people around her, a sort of buttoned up assistant and a mysterious girlfriend. The book is just an absolute blast. There are also 2 novellas in the world as well. And I'm honestly just desperate for more. So I would highly recommend this story. Next up is Half a Soul, which is just one of the most delightful books I have ever read in my life. I know that a lot of romantasy is popular because it's steamy, and this is like a very PG romantasy. It follows a girl who is from a sort of wealthy family, and as a child, a fairy tries to steal her soul. She's able to push them off, and they escape with half of her soul, which leaves her sort of like emotionally detached from the world around her. She reads like a very sort of neurodiverse main character, and she doesn't quite fit into all of the rules of the Regency world around her. She comes to London for the season with her cousin, and while there meets the king's sorcerer, and things sort of unfold from there. But it is just one of the sweetest, most like kick your feet and giggle kind of stories you can imagine. And I really loved it. There's more in the series, so I'm eager to read more. But this is just top notch. I read it very quickly. It's a fast read if you're looking for something like that. I also have a little sci-fi here with All Systems Red by Martha Wells. I have the first 4 books in the Murderbot series now, and these are super popular. They've actually just been turned into a TV series on Apple TV. It follows a sort of like accidentally sentient security robot in this far-flung sci-fi setting in space. And it's a sort of mystery of the week kind of story. So we get like a case-based mystery that gets solved in the course of each novella, and then they all feed into like a larger arc that is still unfolding. The books are funny and relatable. Murderbot manages to be like an anxious, TV-obsessed robot, which sounds a lot like the rest of us. And I think its relatability is really its appeal. So they're very easy listening, and I find them to be very accessible books because they're so short. So I'd highly recommend, if you've been on the fence about them, it's worth picking up. Look out. It's the last book. This is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is kind of the only non-fantasy or sci-fi book in my fiction list, and it's a heavy one, but it is an absolutely beautiful story. It follows a man, a father, a business owner in Ireland in the 80s, the week of Christmas. And he discovers that there is a Magdalen laundry in his backyard. Magdalen laundries are a really dark part of very recent modern Irish history. It asks the question, what does a normal person do when faced with the real horror that the world can produce? And it's a really compelling story. It is a novella as well, super duper short. I think it's like a 3-hour read if you listen to it on audio. But it's one of the most compelling stories I've seen since reading again. And it's one of the only books I've seen that really grapples with the Magdalen laundries. So I highly, highly, highly recommend it. There you go. That is my massive book haul. Almost 20 books, I think, purchased over the last 7 months. I hope you got some good book recommendations out of this video. I would love to know what you've purchased lately, what made it from your reading list to your bookshelves. And I will see you all soon in another video. Bye.